Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi, and welcome to the ISO Show. During the last episode, I gave a brief introduction to the business continuity standard ISO 22301 and the benefits. I think we've all seen the damage caused to businesses over the last few months, unfortunately, and whether it's damage to brand reputation or a direct hit to corporate finances. But the reality is, coronavirus or no coronavirus, businesses do get interrupted for all sorts of reasons, and that's through no fault of their own. In fact, according to our sources, 96% of businesses experienced an outage within a 3-year period. And the average cost of downtime is up to £9,373 in the UK, or in dollars, US dollars, it's $11,500 per minute. That's significant financial loss for any business. And the data also reveals that only 54%, so only half of UK organisations are confident that their business continuity plans are up to date. Here to tell us how to implement a world-class business continuity management system is Rachel Churchman, who will take you through how to implement a BCMS and achieve certification to ISO 22301. Rachel brings a wealth of experience of implementing the standard, as she's been doing this with our clients at Blackmores for a number of years now. And these clients range from law firms right through to global facilities management companies. So welcome, Rachel.
Thanks, Mel. Thanks for having me again. Nice to be here.
Great. It's good to have you back, Rach. Over the next 3 episodes then, what we've done is we've broken down the implementation of the standard into 3 simple steps: create, share, and engage. So let's kick off. Where do we even begin, Rachel?
Okay, Mel, so the best place to start with any management system is just understanding what the company has in place already. So from BCP perspective, we're looking at, what resilience measures they've already undertaken. So we complete this through undertaking a gap analysis. So this, like many other gap analysis for other standards, will walk through the requirements clause by clause, and it helps us to understand what the business has in place already. But more than that, as a consultant, it kind of helps me to understand how the business ticks. What are the activities and the aspects of the business, what are the different departments and people involved, and understanding what it is that they do potentially could disrupt that, as well as walking through the normal clauses to understand what management system elements they might have in place already. It's also that great opportunity to meet the team, and as you know, I like to develop a team of champions whenever I'm working with companies. So I'm looking to identify those key champions in the business and sourcing them from relevant and different areas in the business. So areas such as top management, finance, HR, legal, communications and marketing, customer support operations, and things like for understanding the supply chain that they may have dependencies on, the procurement team as well. So by sort of getting to know all of these areas of the business, understanding the people, you really get under the skin of the business to understand what they need in terms of resilience. So once we've undertaken the gap analysis, we're obviously left with a sort of task list, if you like, a to-do list of areas that we may need to go and have a bit of a deeper look at to see whether there's any additional elements we need to add in, but also to understand what they've already got in place.
So where would you say that the biggest gaps typically are when you get this team together and you start going through the requirements of the standard? Where would you say are the main kind of action points for companies?
Good question, Mel. Well, in my experience, if they haven't got a management system in place already, most of the gaps tend to be around the management system elements, things like internal audit, management review, corrective action. In terms of business continuity gaps, a lot of companies will have a business continuity plan in place, but it may just focus on things like loss of office or fire, the big things, the reasonably foreseeable things. And typically the company hasn't perhaps looked in a bit of a more granular detail at some of the other disruptions that can really disrupt how they operate their business. So for instance, I mentioned supply chain before. A lot of companies now have dependencies on third-party organisations that might support everything they do, and that can be from IT, infrastructure, through to logistics and transport. And if one of these fails or lets them down, it can really disrupt how they operate their business, like you say, through no fault of their own. And sometimes the biggest gap is actually formally looking and reviewing those dependencies in the business. And we'll come on to that when we look at BIA and risk assessment.
That's great. Thanks, Rach.
Okay, so after we've undertaken the gap analysis, the next thing we need to do is undertake a context review. So this helps us understand the wider internal and external issues that can impact the business, and that can be positively as well as negatively. Part of the context review also gets us to review those interested parties, those stakeholders internally and externally, that may need to get involved in our business continuity processes. So as I mentioned before, key suppliers on whom we've got a dependency. We need to understand who they are, and potentially we may even need to get them involved in the project as well, because they are so key. Other areas are identifying single points of failure within the business. So where we've got a dependency in the business, and that can be people, knowledge and experience. It can be suppliers that we've mentioned. We also look at things like key systems or solutions in the business. And a good example of that could be a CRM system that perhaps lots of different areas of the business will feed into and rely on. And it actually almost runs their business for them because it's workflowed and it sends out tasks and activities. If that was to fail, that can be a serious disruption to the business. So it's a potential single point of failure.
So that single point of failure then could be system-based, it could be process-based, or activity-based then, couldn't it? So really you need to look at all different types of scenarios of how things could go wrong and affect the business.
Yeah, absolutely, Mel. And that's actually, we're just coming on to that actually, that's where we look at business impact assessment for the business. So business impact and risk assessment is the beating heart of the BCP, because this is where we really do drill down into sort of the nitty-gritty of how we run our business. It requires us to look at the activities we undertake, everything we need to do in order to be able to run our business effectively. By reviewing those key activities, we are then looking to fully understand the risks to those activities. What can disrupt us? What can interrupt us? What can fail and impact us indirectly? And it's by reviewing these key activities and then, as you say, exploring the potential risks and the potential disruptions that we understand where the risks are and where perhaps we need to define that plan B, because essentially that's what business continuity is all about. It's having a well-rehearsed plan B that we can move on to if that disruption actually, comes to life. And by understanding the risk assessments and the risks and the hazards, we can then use these to put together our response plans and our actual business continuity strategy for the business.
On the business impact analysis document then, I know that obviously you mentioned that, and the risk assessment is the kind of the beating heart of the business continuity management system, which is a great way of putting it. Just to remind listeners that we have got a free template available for the business impact analysis. So you just need to go onto our website, www.blackmoresuk.com, to get hold of a copy of that. Great. So could you just share with us a bit more information about the BIA then, Rachel? Because that does seem to be a key document to really getting to understand what the risks and interdependencies are. What else does it kind of cover? And you mentioned about that kind of triggers off what response plans are needed. Could you give us some type of example as well once you've explained a bit more about the BIA?
Yeah, sure, Mel. So as I said, the business impact analysis looks at understanding the potential disruptions to our operations. But it doesn't just look to understand what the disruption could be. It gets us to really think about the impact of that disruption and how that affects the business. So it gets us to look at potential reputational damage, financial penalties, legal or contractual compliance issues, cash flow, revenue. As part of that review, we are looking to define, what are we comfortable with? What is our maximum period of disruption that we can tolerate as a business? At what point does it become untenable? And at what point would we need a business continuity response, that plan B, to kind of come in and get things back to at least some level of operation? It looks to also understand what we may need in order to recover our position and get back to a level of operation. So, for instance, backup data. What's our recovery point objective? If something goes down, so let's take that example of that CRM system, how long are we able to work as a business without that CRM system? Can we manually work around the activities we need to cover in more of a manual basis, good old-fashioned Excel, Word and email? But when we get that system back online, how much of a backup, how much data do we need to get back? We've got to consider how long it's going to take us to re-input a lot of information. So we want to ensure that our backup is aligned with our recovery point objectives within our BCP. So BCP is not standalone. It is going to talk to lots of different areas of the business, to include your IT, your logistics and your supply chain, because they may have requirements on us that affect our recovery point objectives as well. And it does also get us to look at our dependencies internally and externally. So I know I keep talking about supply chain, but we need to understand who is key and where do they fit into our BCP. Is it fundamental that they have that support for us when we need it? Are we actually checking and asking our suppliers what their business continuity arrangements are? Because if they are a key dependency, we also need to seek assurance that they've got their ducks in a row as well. And also within the BIA, we need to understand whether there's any contractual or compliance obligations that we need to maintain, because financial and reputational damage of breaching these obligations can also impact us. So although we may be quite happy to sort of carry on at a level of operation, if it's below an agreed contractual level, actually that can impact us negatively. So we need to take all of this into account when we are doing our business impact analysis. So an example, Mel, of how a BIA will inform the sort of response of a business. There's lots of different examples, but I guess one that is probably familiar to a lot of people at the moment might be sort of the pandemic response plan. So a business impact analysis undertaken would have looked at what would pandemic mean to an organisation, and it may have been phased. So it may have been looking at how a business responds to people coming into work but having to social distance. Then obviously as the situation changes, it may have then sort of moved on and aligned with perhaps a separate response plan for loss of office if the office was closed. And business impact analysis, some examples, of clients I've worked with, they've potentially had 2 different response plans that they've had to kind of bring together as the whole COVID response has developed. And early on, they identified that working from home was a strategy that worked for them based on business impact analysis, because through the BIA, they understood who could work from home, what systems and solutions they had in place to enable that strategy for their staff. Part of the sort of testing and exercising that they'd undertaken as part of implementing the management system was to test access to systems from home, but in a calm environment. So actually they were able to deploy their response plans quite seamlessly to enable their staff to work from home. And we wouldn't have been able to do that if we hadn't gone through the business impact analysis at the beginning of the project, because we wouldn't have understood who could work from home, what could they do, what was the operational level as a result of them working from home.
Great, thanks for giving us an idea of what that kind of response plan might look like as a result of a BIA. Could you just talk us through response plans in a bit more detail then?
Yep, sure. So response plans will look to cover what we have assumed would be the situation based on our business impact analysis. So we've made a review of what risks and what things could disrupt us. We understand what our capabilities are, and now we need to put all of that together to put together a cohesive response plan that can be picked up and used to communicate and get staff to work the way we need them to work. So response plans do and will contain some assumptions because we can't foresee the granular nuances of every situation. Every situation is going to be slightly different, so there will be some assumptions made in the plan. But these will be fairly high level and reasonably foreseeable assumptions. It's key that the response plans identify responsibilities, and that includes who can actually invoke and stand down the plan. So who can actually declare a business continuity situation, and who can call the business continuity situation off and bring things back to normal. There's also going to be responsibilities for who does what in a response plan. And that might be, for most staff, simply understanding who's going to tell them when we're in a business continuity situation and what do they need to do. They're very much following orders. But there will be a team of people in the response plan that are actually the implementers, if you like. They're the doers in a response plan. We also need to identify the business recovery objectives. So we need to understand, what is the response plan looking to achieve. So that can include recovery time objectives, how quickly do we want to get back to some level of operation, and it might not be 100%. And what do we need in order to get us back to that position? So what are the recovery point objectives that we need to achieve? We need to understand who's impacted directly or indirectly through the actual incident, the disruption. And we need to have a recovery strategy at a very high level. And that is going to include communication requirements, which we'll come on to in the next podcast, because communication is key. The response plan will then ideally walk through step by step with timings the different phases of business continuity response. So the first phase is always the emergency phase. So this is when an incident is reported or understood by the business. And this is where there will be some big decisions made at a very senior level as to what do we need to do, what response plan are we going to implement, and it's that invocation of business continuity to the business, so the wider communication. We then move into the recovery phase. So this is actually invoking that response strategy and the actual plan. And that will walk through the different elements that need to be undertaken in that plan. And these will be different for every company. There's certain areas that might be common across all, but it's very much down to the business to define that plan. And then lastly, there's the restoration phase. So this is where we're looking to return to normal operations. So a good example of that is the COVID situation at the moment. You can see we have already walked through the emergency phase where it's being seen as a threat for the UK, where government have been looking and reviewing all of the information available to them, speaking to specialists, and they've been making those big decisions and deciding when they're going to invoke that lockdown, that business continuity phase. So the recovery phase is what we've been through in the last period. So we've all been given very clear guidance on what we need to do in terms of staying home and protecting the NHS. And we've been kept up to date at every step. So we've had daily communications from the government, so you can clearly see that the communication side of things is key to making sure everybody knows what they should be doing in terms of business continuity response. And just recently, as we are recording this podcast, we are just moving into this restoration phase. So now we're looking at how do we return to normal safely. And that's very much going to be applied in every BCP situation as well. What do we need to do to get things back to as normal as possible? And understanding that it might not be the same normal as from before the BCP event. It might be a different normal.
That's great. Thanks for providing those examples, Rachel. I know that recently, as a result of COVID-19, and we've got a lot more people working remotely and working from home, it's also triggered off other issues as well. And again, it could be related to business continuity management with all these cyber incidents that are happening. So in theory, I guess the business continuity plans can help in those scenarios as well, can't they? Because I know that some companies have come under attack and have lost access to all email. They can't communicate. Okay, so obviously that's one type of incident, but there could be lots of different types of scenarios that could have resulted in that loss of email. So it's again the same recovery process, I guess, would come into effect. Obviously the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, need to be informed, but the recovery process will still be exactly the same, won't it? So I think it's really helpful that in some respects, you've provided a holistic approach to business continuity, but again, provided some more kind of granular examples of how it can work in practice. So thanks for that. So is the next stage the documentation then, pulling that all together? So you've actually got some tangible documents and information in place to show an assessor when it comes to like a stage 1 assessment. So what kind of documents would you typically have in place, Rachel? And also, if we could cover, if a company's already got a management system in place, what does it mean for them as well?
Okay, yes. So as with any ISO management system, there is a requirement to fulfill certain clauses, which may require certain documents as evidence within the management system. So I'll start with your last point, actually. If a client already has a management system in place, say 9001 for quality or 27001 for information security, then we can absolutely use some of the core procedures and look to integrate them so that we're just running the one manageable system. The requirements within ISO 22301 are very similar to those already in place. Interestingly, we are going to cover on another podcast the changes to ISO 22301 as it has recently been updated. And actually one of the benefits of the recent update is clearer alignment with the new HLS standards. Because the business continuity standard was actually one of the very first standards to originally go on the high-level structure format with the clauses 4 to 10. So there are some subtle changes and nuances with the clause alignment that have been improved with the recent version. In terms of documentation, so the key documents that you would look to have in place, some of them we've talked through already, are the context review. So having that look at the internal, external issues and the risks and opportunities that might arise as part of that review. Then moving on to the business impact analysis and risk assessment. These, as I said, are the sort of the heart of the management system. These are key in terms of the 22301 management system, because without these, we then can't competently complete the response plans and define the strategy. We do also then need to have a business continuity plan itself. So this is how do we respond? How do we do it? And the business continuity plan will talk through the methodology for business continuity, because obviously it's not a one-time review. Business continuity plans and processes need to be reviewed and updated as things change. There's also a requirement to understand responsibilities in the business. So I've seen this done in different ways in different businesses. Some companies will have teams defined for business continuity. So they might have a platinum team, a gold team, a silver team, and bronze level staff. And each level will have different responsibilities under BCP. Other organisations might have defined responsibilities on a more granular level, on a departmental level. But either way, we need to clearly have that defined somewhere in the management system so that people know what their responsibilities are under BCP. We also need to have some kind of communication process in place. And that can entail things like a communication plan, which is very important when implementing a management system so that everyone understands the journey we're on. But for business continuity, communication is key in terms of communicating before, during and after an event. A good example of this might be crisis management. So if you have an incident that causes potential reputational damage to your business, having a process in place that it is rehearsed and understood for things like speaking to the media or speaking to the authorities. In the event of a disruption that could cause reputational damage, we don't want to be saying the wrong things at the wrong time to the wrong people, because that can just make the whole situation worse. We also need to have those granular response plans. So we've got the overarching plan for business continuity for the business, but we may have response plans in different areas within the business. You may only have a response plan for one department for one particular threat, but for that department, that response plan is very, very important. So there might be various levels of response plan in an organisation. And I've worked with companies that have lots, and I've worked with companies that may only have 3 or 4 high-level response plans, but they're all equally as effective. In line with other management systems, we will also have core controls around documented information, which ensures that people have the right information available to them at the right time. So in terms of business continuity, that's vital that people are all working to the same response plan. It's also looking at how we make the management system for business continuity available to people in the event of a disruption. So normally we have things on SharePoint or things that can be accessed via a server, but actually if it's a server or a network or a system that is affected by BCP, we need to also have a plan B for how we can make the documentation available. So that's slightly different in business continuity. We also then need to look at awareness. So the communication plan is about telling people what they need to be doing and what their responsibilities are, but we also need to ensure that there is some awareness in the business. So we will have training resources, whether that's through training courses, through e-learning, or through on-the-job type training. We need to make sure that that's in place and can be referred back to. We also need to ensure that we are self-checking. So like every management system, there'll be some form of internal auditing. But we also need to be testing and exercising our business continuity plan, which we'll come on to in another podcast. But that is another key document, is to have some kind of program in place for self-checking and testing that everything's going to work for us. From a supply chain point of view, it's best practice to have some kind of dependency review on your supply chain, so we understand who we might need to involve in our own BCP. So that's another key document that we would want to be holding on to. And then lastly, it's things like the management reviews, which is the holistic review of the management system, and also the results of testing and exercising and lessons learned from anything that's happened in the period from a management system point of view.
Excellent. Thanks, Rachel, for sharing all your experience and tips with us today on creating that management system. And we really look forward to more of your little golden BCP nuggets of information on the next episode, where we'll be delving into the launch of the business continuity system and the sharing of it with all employees and stakeholders. So thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mel. Yeah, I enjoy speaking to you again in the next podcast.
So for those of you that like any more information on business continuity, or if you'd like to pick up that free copy of your business impact analysis, please just go to our website, www.blackmoresuk.com. And in the meantime, I look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.